Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webcast, Masterclass, Modernizing Performance Reviews so they actually work, sponsored by emPerform. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, click on the Q&A tab in your webinar controls and type them there. A new tab will open in your browser with the webcast survey. Please be sure to complete it as soon as the webcast is ended. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to John Smith for the presentation.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's presentation. My name is John. I'm a Senior Director of Global Business Applications at Quisitive, and I've spent the better part of the last 21 years helping to build out our performance management tool, emPerform. And during the time I've worked with, as you can imagine, a lot of clients on a lot of performance management processes. We've seen a lot of things, and really excited today to share a bit of that experience with you as we go through the presentation. Just in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about the current state of performance management and how to modernize the performance reviews to suit a modern workforce. We have 3 performance management models we're going to talk about, and practical and cost-effective changes you can make today for some impact, how to better align goals, performance, and feedback to effectively energize and support your workforce. And we're going to end up just with a view of our top 5 review templates that work across 90% of the organizations we work with. So let's kick things off. In the last 21 years, when we talk to organizations about their performance management process and why they're trying to improve it, what do you think we hear? Well, we hear things like, this process is inefficient, and it's administrative. There's too much paper. Getting supervisors to complete it is challenging. Managers don't want to participate. The evaluations aren't really accurate. We're not getting buy-in. There's consistency issues, and the list goes on and on and on. And so we listen and we say, well, okay, what kind of review form are you using? And here we have a snapshot of just some of the thousands of performance reviews we've seen that come into us when we start these engagements. And, we look through them and we listen and we say, aha, we've arrived at a key conclusion. There is a big gap in the perceived value of what is desired and what's being delivered. And so we want to talk about this a little bit. What makes this process valuable? And there's 3 perspectives that are important here. We talk first about the employee perspective, and the employee saying, well, what's expected of me? How do you gauge my success? How am I doing? I want feedback. How can I progress in my career? What options do I have? How can you help me get there? Okay, that's reasonable. From a manager perspective, it's all about my team, right? Are we meeting the organization goals? Do I have the right team to support the goals in front of me? What support and resources does my team need to succeed? How can I help them improve performance? How are they working together, and how are we helping the organization reach its goals? And obviously, from an HR and leadership perspective, we want to know that our people are supporting the organizational goals we have, and that we're on track and we have the right resources internally to deliver on the commitments that we've made. We want to know where we're going to invest in development and recruiting, and we want to really have a pulse really on the drivers of engagement and retention and what's going on out there. So, you sit back and say, well, if I've got a process and it's not delivering this value, how do I figure out how to drive value? What do we need to do to fix it? And so one place we all look, of course, is our friend Google, and we say, well, what's happening out there in the world of performance management? And we look at articles, we go to classes, we get educated on what's happening and what the trends are. And, one of the things we noticed is, roughly 10 years ago, so kind of halfway into my performance management journey over the last 20 years, there's a bit of a revolution that took place. And this revolution started with some big names who got a lot of attention for blowing up their traditional performance review process. And, this is GE, Adobe, Deloitte, and Microsoft. I want to talk a little bit about each one of these, but, what's really important here is, they deserve to get some attention. These are big organizations with huge numbers of employees spread across the globe, and they made fundamental process changes. And I think because of that, they deserve some attention, and we should take a look at them, and we should see what we can learn a little bit from each of them. So let's talk about them just briefly here. In terms of GE, prior to making this change, had used a very traditional, we call it traditional, a very traditional performance review process. It was a rigid system with scoring and ratings, and they had this process at the end where they released 10% of the bottom rated employees. It was known as a rank and yank system. And they knew they had to make radical changes. And so what's interesting is why their reasons were for making the changes. They said, you know what? And this is important. The world doesn't work on an annual basis anymore. So this concept that the annual performance review just doesn't fit with the way the world works. We also have a younger workforce. We have millennials, and they're interested in frequent, fast, mobile-enabled feedback. They want this continuous feedback. GE also recognized they're a very highly matrixed environment where one employee works closely and is connected and heavily influenced by a large number of other employees, and these relationships change. It could be on a project by project basis. So it's not really like an annual setup anymore, and it didn't really make sense. So what did they do? Well, they developed internally a continual feedback application called Performance Development at GE. Its acronym is PD at GE. And basis of it is that employees go in and they set priorities in the app, and they ask others for feedback, and they provide feedback to others. And this really guides conversations and helps the whole concept of continuous improvement. Okay, well, let's look at somebody else. Who's next here? Let's talk about Adobe for a second, because they also blew up their traditional time-consuming annual stacked rank process, and they went to something less formal and something they're quite proud of with their frequent check-in system. And the idea here is that managers and employees meet for check-in discussions at least once every quarter, and the discussion covers 3 topics. It covers expectations, it covers feedback, and career growth and development, right? And expectations, this will come up later. That's also tied into objectives and goals, right? So think of it as goals and objectives, feedback, growth and development. And the idea is that these discussions happen in real time when the feedback is relevant, as opposed to logging it somewhere and remembering to discuss it months and months later. They don't use ratings anymore. And when we get to the merit process, they really rely on managers being given a budget and being educated on, how to award within the ranges that have been established. I will say that Adobe has shared a lot of what they've done here. They feel they've really revolutionized the check-in process, and they proudly have published many of the documents that they've created and how employees and managers can prepare for the check-in. So it is something that if you're interested in a check-in process that's really, really well articulated, check out Adobe and do a search, because you'll get some great content there. Now, oops, I don't know what's happening here. Hold on, something happened. I apologize. Let's just go back here. Okay, so we want to talk next about Deloitte. And Deloitte also went through a process of updating their performance review cycle. And just like GE and Adobe, they got rid of the annual cascading objectives, numeric rankings. They were doing 360 reviews, and they stopped doing that. They claimed they were spending 2 million hours each year assigning ratings to employees, and they really wanted to simplify the process. So one thing they did is they stopped asking everybody to weigh in on everybody else's performance. And instead, they asked only the team leader for input. And you can see right there, that's very different than what we saw with GE and Adobe. So this is very much team leader based. They simplified the evaluation by getting rid of all the competency and skill ratings and moving to a process that really asks 4 questions to the manager, which is, given what I know of this person's performance, and if it were my money, would I award this person the highest possible compensation increase and bonus? Question 1. Question 2, given what I know of this person's performance, I'd always want him or her on my team. Question 3, is this person at risk for low performance? And question 4, is this person ready for a promotion today? So, a very different approach that got used here. But again, it was all about changing up the way things had been done historically. So the last one, and the one we like to talk about, is Microsoft. And candidly, Quisitive's a big Microsoft partner, so we're always interested in what's going on at Microsoft, and we hear a lot about the performance review process. There's certainly anybody who's out there who's aware of what Microsoft is doing, that their leader, Satya Nadella, has really been changing a lot of things at Microsoft since he joined, and has been instrumental in the success that Microsoft is seeing right now. When he joined in 2014, he had an idea that employees needed to adopt this growth mindset, and that skills and hard work and challenges are all opportunities to learn, and that that requires discussion on a frequent basis to ensure that everybody's thinking the same way about this. And so employees at Microsoft now meet their managers in a series of what they call connects, and this happens throughout the year. And this allows employees and managers to talk about performance on a more frequent basis than just annually or once a year. And so if you think of these four companies here, they have something in common, right? They've all moved away from this traditional review process, and they've moved to something that has more touch points. There's more frequent check-ins during the process. Continual feedback is at the heart of what they did. And so this begs the question, if we're all having challenges with our performance review process, is this what we should do? And what does this mean for the rest of us? Well, that's our goal today. It's to really bring this subject to the forefront and, really try to understand how we can interpret this what's happening in this performance management world and what it means for our organization. Because, one thing I've learned is that there's not necessarily a right way to do performance management. There's no script that you can follow that says, if I do the following things, I guarantee it will work. This is all about fit within your organization and your employee base, and we have to allow it to grow over time. And so we're going to look at three models. These three models are our construction, a little bit maybe consultative. When we go into consulting engagements, we talk about these three models because I think it's important to understand where your performance management process is to understand what you want to do with it and what you can do with it. So we'll talk about the three models. We'll take you through a framework to identify which model fits your organization. So we're going to ask you guys to keep track here and answer some questions in your head and follow along as we do this. And, lastly, we'll help you walk away with some direction on where to take this. Okay. So with that in mind, let's talk about these three models. We call them classic, modern, and radical. They're models of performance management. So we think that all of the models are good models, and we know that in all scenarios, these models can drive reward and succession decisions. We have clients that use more than one model with their employee base. We usually see that organizations are trying to evolve from the classic model to something more modern, or in some cases more radical. And, again, this is part of what we do when we talk to organizations more from a consulting framework, and we're going to try and do this in a little bit higher level to work through this. So let's talk about these models in detail. First, the classic model. The classic model is probably what you know today and what you think of as a dreaded performance review. It's year-end focused. It's a manager-employee dialogue. There's an upper management review usually. The content is usually about objectives and skills and competencies. There's formal ratings, and 9 times out of 10, it'll be a 5-point rating scale that talks about exceeds expectations to meets expectations to does not meet expectations. It can be improved by automating the process and performance journals and adjusting rating scales. We're going to talk about that because the classic model has a place in performance management today. There's no question. And sometimes it's just some subtle improvements that are needed to drive the value from it. Okay, so we'll talk about this in more detail as we go along. Our second model is what we call the modern model. And really what it does is it takes the classic model and it incorporates mid-year or quarterly or monthly feedback, as well as continuous feedback loops in it. Oftentimes, it brings more voices into the process with peers and other stakeholders. Sometimes it's 360 review that comes into it. And I think one of the important differentiators between classic and modern is that there's a nice balance here between kind of the rear view mirror and what we've done and what we look back at, to content in the review that talks about what we're doing going forward. Okay. And, there's lots of improvement. We'll talk about how we can improve this here as well. But it is similar in one way to the classic model. Both classic and modern have an annual focus. These are models that end the year with a performance review. And usually that's because the organization has a need to drive some decisions, whether it's compensation or talent review or succession or many of these other things that require some stake in the ground to say, here's performance at the end of the period. So classic and modern deal with that. Our third model, radical, is slightly different. And really where the big differentiator comes is the first bullet. There's no annual focus, right? So this is more like Adobe's model or Microsoft's model. It's a continuing dialogue that's going on between the employee and manager. There's monthly, quarterly, or ad hoc check-ins that are happening. It's based on, in the moment that, we established this goal. How are we tracking towards it? Do we need to change it? We make lots of comments on progress. We look for peers to provide feedback. We give upward feedback as employees, right? And the content's very different. The content does not include formal ratings. There's short-term objectives, long-term development is discussed. But, oftentimes this is about objectives that are in front of us. It's about career development, and it's about some feedback and honesty and just moving to the next piece and getting ready for, the next time period. And so this is how these differentiate. And when we stand back and we think about the beginning of this presentation, all those performance reviews we showed you, I always say we could have a museum of performance reviews because we have so many of them that organizations have sent us over the years. We can literally put these clients in one of these three camps and say, which one is it? So to figure this out and to really unpack this in more detail, we'll take you through this. One last thing I want to say about radical that's very interesting just before we do this is that it's actually the smallest percentage of our clients use a radical model. Like I would say, in the 10 to 20% range is what we see as this, and that's why we call it radical, because it's small, and yet, it's an irony in a way because the organizations that are practicing this are the ones getting all the attention. So, that's why we got to figure out which model's right for you. And so we'll take you through the framework. It's really based on these three elements of people, process, and content. And, it goes without saying, we could get really theoretical and academic here, but that's not what we're trying to do today. We're really just trying to hone in and make this practical. We want to separate our thinking here a little bit between the performance management process and the review form itself. And so what we're going to start with now is let's talk about the process and alignment of people and organization. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about content and what we can do with the content to make the review form itself much better. Okay, so we're gonna start with the people and organization alignment dimension. And in this, what we're really talking about is leadership. We're talking about employee perspective. We're talking about history with performance management. And we're just talking about some industry alignment in this dimension of thinking. And so as we go through this, what I want you to do, we're going to ask some questions. And I want you to think in your head, hey, where do we fit? Think as we ask these questions, kind of put a check mark in your head between the answers you think, and we'll show you, what model this relates to. So let's think about leadership for a second. Okay, so where would you describe your organization? Our managers struggle with the process, and it is going to be a stretch for them to take on more in performance management. Next one, our managers are mixed in their people management capabilities, but there's organizational support for training and improvement and development for those managers that need it. The third one, we have a strong leadership team interested in building a high performance work culture. Our managers are strong and can easily transition to coaching and mentoring roles. Okay, So hopefully one of these fits where you guys think you are in your organizations. Here's our recommendation that comes through. We think if managers struggle with the process and it's a stretch to take on more, we're probably sticking with the classic model, because that's gonna focus them on a time period where we can put a lot of support behind getting through the process. If managers are mixed in their people management capabilities, but there's support for training and improvement, then we're going to look at this modern model. And if you got really strong leadership and you got a really strong management team, we think either modern or radical would fit. Okay, next one, the employee dimension. Let's select what best describes your employees. Engagement levels are low. Employees are asking for more feedback on a more frequent basis. Employees are confused by the performance review or the rating system, and in some cases, they're very confused by its relationship to merit or succession decisions. Let's think next. Employees like our existing process. It just needs a few tweaks. Okay, so let's see where your answers come out on that. And here's what we come back with. If employee engagement levels are low, we're going to recommend a modern platform, because one of the things it's going to try to do is improve employee engagement by increasing the frequency and touch point of feedback. That's really, really important. If employees are asking for more frequent feedback, then obviously modern or even radical would fit. If employees are confused by the rating system and its relation to merit decisions, we think modern or radical would fit. And if employees say they like our process, it just needs a few tweaks, then I think modern would fit here as well. What you're not seeing on this perspective is where classic fits. So let's keep that in mind. Okay, let's talk about our experience with employee performance management as an organization. This is new for us. We want to try new things, but management is rigid and has no appetite. This is not a new process, but it's one in need of repair. We've tried this and it's just not working. We're either stopping the performance management process altogether or we're dramatically changing it. And the answers in this scenario would be that if it's a new process for us, we're going to default to the modern process. We know that, that's very successful. Obviously, that's the basis of the presentation today. If we want to try new things, but management's really rigid and doesn't really have an appetite for it, then we think classic fits, and we think classic can fit and work there. If it's not a new process, but one in need of repair, we usually gravitate towards modern here. And lastly, this comes up. Hey, we've tried everything and it's just not working. We either stop the whole thing or we blow it up and make it totally different. Then, clearly that's saying to us, that's a radical recommendation. All right. Lastly, there's one here that is also important. Sometimes this one's overlooked. This comes up with us actually more than you would think. Okay. So this is the industry you're in and how regulated it is. So are you regulated? We're not regulated. We can do what we want with performance management, or we're highly regulated and or compliance driven. Okay, and depending on your answer here, it actually is going to give you a different recommendation. So, if you're not regulated and you can do what you like, well, you can pick any of the three models. But if you're highly regulated or compliance driven, it's still back to that classic model. And again, we see this a lot. We see it out there in organizations, certain industry sectors, unionized organizations that are very compliance driven. And we have those classic models out there. They're quite rigid and they're required just because that's the way the process has to work inside that organization. So, this is what we think about when we think about this people and organization alignment dimensions. So coming out of one of the three dimensions, we've only done the first one. Hopefully you got a bit of a sense in your head about where you need to go, but there's still two more dimensions to discuss here. So let's talk about process and some things we need to consider from a process perspective. First is time, second is frequency of feedback, and the third is the forward, versus backward looking orientation. And so these are also important as we select our models. Okay. So first of all, on time. Well, let's think about it. I love this quote. Adobe estimated 80,000 hours of its manager time was required each year to conduct the reviews, equivalent of nearly 40 full-time employees working year-round. Okay, and we see this complaint a lot. The complaints usually when we go into implement a new performance review process with an organization, you talk to their management team, usually somebody in the room is asking, how long is it going to take to do it? And so, we think we've got to really think about this time element a little bit. Deloitte had the 2 million hours that they mentioned. If you look at the manager time in the chart, you see a manager with 5 to 7 direct reports says, 55% of them are spending more than 31 hours a year on performance management. So, is the question I have here is it time that's really the issue here? Let's unpack this a little bit. What we see is that it's not really the time it takes that's the issue. It's the value of the time that's spent that's the issue, right? And let's think about, I love this argument about time value. We spend all kinds of time on non-value added things in organizational life, as you all know, whether it's reading emails that we get closed copied on, that we wish we didn't have to read, but we keep up with it, to, meetings that are unstructured, that are not well organized. The list goes on and on and on. And so really, I think what we're trying to say is, hey, we want to see some value, right? We want to see some value that we've spent. And there's a question here on that quote before, is 30 to 50 hours enough time in the context of a 5-person team? Consider how much money that 5-person team is costing the organization to ensure they're performing and happy and getting the feedback that they need and they're satisfied. Maybe the reality here is time's not going to go down, it's going to actually go up. And so our goal with this is really to balance the time spent, really so everybody sees that return on investment. When we think about frequency of feedback, what we're thinking about here is, how do we formally engage employees in a performance dialogue more than once a year? We know that feedback is incredibly important. And, if we do it once a year, we got all these problems, the traditional recency bias, and, we only remember the last 6 to 8 weeks, unless we're super organized and we're taking notes throughout the year. We've got, things that we've kept mementos on, or a little performance diary or journal that, helps us remember key elements of feedback. And so we know that, if we're going to increase the frequency of feedback, we need to increase the tool set. We need to increase the number of touch points. Once a year discussion really doesn't lead to value, because the employee's probably saying, hey, if I'm only getting this feedback now for something that happened 9 months ago, it's not really allowing me to do any quick course correction. If I'd known that many months ago, I might have changed my behavior or changed how I oriented myself towards that objective. So we know, it's obvious, the frequency of feedback is crucially important. You see across these 4 organizations that we started with, this was a big component of what they changed, right? So, we know there's stats out there that are important. We know 76% of employees want at least monthly performance feedback. 4 out of 10 workers are actively disengaged when they don't get feedback. 60% of respondents said they want feedback on a daily, weekly basis. More than 75% that said the feedback's valuable to their work. And, 97% of Gen Z is open to receiving feedback, and 67% want it in a timely, constructive manner throughout the year. Takeaway: regular feedback makes employees 3 times more likely to be engaged in their work. So what we see is that with proper structure and training, it's possible for organizations to embrace frequent feedback. I'm going to go out here and say this is the single biggest change I've seen in the last 21 years of being in the performance management space. It is this orientation towards increasing the frequency of feedback. We can all agree that's a fact. People want frequent feedback. And so what we need to develop is a process for feedback that happens more than once a year. And when we're out there talking about how to improve a performance management process, This is central. This is one of the key points, and I think it is one of the really important takeaways from GE, Adobe, Deloitte, and Microsoft is frequency of feedback. We know the changes are going to need to be supported by structure and training. We can't just say increase the frequency of feedback, management team, because we know we need managers that are going to have to be trained on that. And sometimes this can start with some baby steps. And here's how we see that, right? Let's look at Adobe's check-in toolkit. Remember, they published a bunch of things out there that are on their process, a bunch of content that they share with organizations about what they've done. And you can see here they've got best practices for a check-in, first expectations, agree on what's expected in terms of deliverable behavior and contributions, feedback, provide frequent two-way feedback on how the employee is progressing, development. Then when employees know how they are performing, they can plan actionable goals in terms of learning and career experience. So Adobe will even say, if you go back, and I've spent lots of time looking at what they've done, their biggest challenge involved creating the mindset for their managers, right? This was a big challenge for them when they instituted the quarterly check-in process. And so they say they invested very heavily in change management with their management team, having them take ownership of this check-in process. And they said significant training and communication in the first 18 months were required to help them be successful. All right, let's go to the next dimension. This one's good. Looking forward. This is a really good quote from Harvard Business Review, the performance management revolution. I loved this one. Back in the day, the biggest limitation of the annual reviews and the main reason more companies are dropping it is this: heavy emphasis on financial rewards and punishment for their year-end structure, holding people accountable for past behavior at the expense of improving current performance and grooming talent for the future. Right? So, really what we're seeing is this problems with the existing processes, that the rear view orientation, right? It's how did I do on those objectives I set? How do you rate me on those competencies? Did I do the employee development and training I said I was going to do, right? Just looking backward. And, one of the things we want to encourage is this forward-looking orientation. It's an easy fix. It's all about how we structure the process. And I honestly it goes hand in hand with the frequency of feedback, and that, this is organizational change and, it requires some training. But we've got some advice here. We're going to get into very shortly just about the content related to this. And so, in a little bit, we'll get into the content side of this, and we'll help you understand, how to address this forward-looking orientation that we want to see in the review process. All right, so let's go back to our questions. Where do you fit here with frequency? What can your employee base and your management team take on? Is this an annual, once-a-year process? Is it quarterly checkpoints, or, you could even say monthly? Quarterly checkpoints and annual, or is it going to be a continual process that you're driving to? What can they handle? And the answers are probably going to be obvious. The once-a-year process is the classic model. The quarterly checkpoints with monthly or annual check-ins is the modern model. And the continual rapid feedback in the moment is our radical model. Let's also think about what we're trying to get out of the process, right? So it's an HR process used to identify weak performers. I'm sure none of you have that. Implicitly linked to compensation or succession decisions. I'm sure many of you are going to line up to that. For us, this is really about employee development and coaching. And lastly, we measure everything from interim appraisals upon closing a project to input from periodic check-ins, performance snapshots, appraisal results, real-time feedback, 360-degree surveys. Depending on how you answered this would be the model recommendation we would have. Okay, so, it's an HR process used to identify weak performers. Well, that's our classic model. It's implicitly linked to comp and succession decisions, classic or modern. For us, it's about employee development and coaching. It's really radical. And then if you're into measuring everything, it's probably a classic or modern model. All right, so we've done people, we've done process. And now what we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about content, right? And how we can actually help to improve the performance review process. And content is honestly one of my favorite areas because we have spent so much time on this. You can appreciate as a performance management vendor, everything we do is about setting up reviews and processes and content. And so lots and lots of time invested in content. And we think this is an area where it actually really helps us reinvent and improve the performance review. We're also going to discuss, when we get into the content here, we're going to discuss goals and objectives, competencies, company values, learning development, career planning. We're going to talk about ratings a little bit as well. And we're going to talk about something new that's come up, most recently. It may be the next big thing in performance management, which is artificial intelligence. So let's talk about these things a little bit here. First, on goals and objectives, right? This is a foundational area in all performance reviews. It applies to all models. And, the advice we usually give here is, 3 to 5 short-term objectives using a goal structure such as the SMART goal structure. Again, making them short-term in nature and allowing the goals to evolve or change over the review period. Meaning that if I set a goal, if we're on an annual process and I set a goal at the beginning of the year, it could be deferred, it could be changed, it could be updated, it could be canceled 3 months later, right? And we have to allow for that to happen. So, I actually think that goals are really, really foundational to a performance process, because even in the radical processes, when we think about priorities, and you hear a lot about OKRs, objectives, and key results, there's a performance planning, and there's all kinds of different acronyms and names that are used to describe goals. But they're so foundational because if we're going to have a check-in, it's the basis of the content for the check-in. So they're hugely important in a performance review process, and it may mean that managers and employees need training to assist in creating goals that are useful for tracking purposes. And no matter what we call them, they apply to all models. The beauty is we can track progress against goals at least quarterly. And that foundation element for check-in conversation and performance discussions means that we can use goals as the basis of more frequent check-ins and discussions. It's the starting point of a conversation with an employee and manager about how they're feeling about things. It's natural to go back to, let's talk about the goals we're trying to achieve and how you're feeling about it, right? So really, really important in our performance reviews. Next content area we talk about is competencies and skills. And these are a hugely popular content area, even though Deloitte might be moving away from them. We really believe that 4 to 6 here is the right number. Competency definitions define the competency, not just what it is, but what success looks like. If they're skill-based, we want to be really specific about it. If it's behavior-based, many clients are finding 5 core company competencies are effective in terms of the number of competencies on which we rate people. And I think, and this comes up in our world in professional services for sure, is that, we use competencies as the basis of observation, right? It's if there's a teamwork, accountability, customer focus, if that's an issue, if the competency is defined well enough, it allows us to have a conversation about that. Also allows us to point out where we have some role models who just do those things really, really well. And I always say to people, if you're a role model in a competency area, everybody around you can see that. They know that. They don't even think about it. They hear your name and they think, wow, that person is really, really organized. They're a role model in the competency. So, we think they fit in many of the organizations we work with, and they certainly fit in that classic and modern model. Okay, and they're also used in peer review and 360, right? So they're a good basis for that. Company values is another one that's a really important one, in that we see more and more companies looking for fit over skill. They want to see alignment with how people think and how they align their work to the company values. I started my career at a Fortune 500 company, And everybody in that organization was assessed and rated on what they called passion and drive for results, because passion and drive for results were a company value, right? And they wanted to know in all the goals and objectives how we aligned that with passion and drive for results. And it's interesting when you take a big group of people who talk about passion and drive for results and it becomes a normal part of the conversation, it actually creates a culture of wanting to achieve. And that's really an interesting one that comes up. We regularly have clients who have a company values section, and they award like a significant percentage of the overall score to, alignment with company values. And some of our clients, it's worth 25% of a rating, for instance. And you can see here with Amazon, right? The quote from Amazon: they regularly check in with employees regarding performance, but mainly to promote company values. It's really important in the Amazon performance review process that the feedback comes together with both values and performance, and that the process leads people to internalize the company's values and align their goals with those values. It fits the classic and modern model. All right, the next one is learning and development. And in learning and development, we feel it fits in the classic and modern model. This is really a good place to be able to link competencies to be developed. And so this is a lot of what we do with our performance review processes, where we say, okay, if we're big into competency development, there's a natural link to employee development based on the ratings that go through the competencies, right? It's, if there's a competency not being observed on a regular basis with someone, then it's a natural to say, okay, how do we help improve that competency? And again, I think one of the values here is this is a forward-looking area. This isn't just looking backwards and saying, hey, here's where I see you in this competency. If we link it to learning and development, then it actually becomes a forward-looking discussion point and gets us out of just rear view focus. So this is also a great area to provide feedback in a formal 360 or peer feedback process that you may have in your organization. And, it does demonstrate commitment to employee development, which I think is important from an employee perspective. Okay, so if those are our content areas, let's talk about how we reinvent or how we modernize this a little bit more. And there's a couple of ways we do this. One is career planning. So this fits in modern models where we add a section that allows employees and managers to ask questions. And it's all about career-based questions. For example, in Adobe, what are short-term career goals? What are long-term career goals? What type of assignments, experience, and coaching, learning do you need to meet your goals? How can your manager help? For managers, we may ask questions that we try to understand the employee's potential. Can they perform at a higher level? Can they perform at a higher level in a different position in a certain period of time? Can you envision the employee performing 2 levels or higher in the next 5 to 6 years? Is the organization likely to value the growth of the skills and competencies over the next several years? Could the employee learn additional skills and competencies? These are all really good questions managers can ask, really to gauge employee potential. And, this also helps us with succession planning and talent plans. But it also is really important because it walks the manager through the questions to ask and the things to consider when they're managing their employees. It lets the employee know their growth matters and that, they can plan on a future with the company. So career planning could be a section you add to a classic model to modernize it. That's the key takeaway. The obvious next one is the quarterly accomplishments or check-ins section, which applies, we think, in all models. And this is a section within emPerform that really tries to deal with 2 things. One is, what are the accomplishments from the prior quarter? And what are the focus areas for the next quarter? Very straightforward. In an annual review process, at least quarterly, we're going to sit down and say, what did we accomplish over the last quarter? What are we going to try to focus on for the next quarter? And, this really helps us with the frequency of feedback. And if you think about it, it ties back to goals and objectives, and it helps frame a more frequent discussion. The next one to consider would be peer review. And, bringing more voices into the process is really important. There's some good feedback and some good evidence that since many organizations have moved to this virtual world as a result of COVID. We've got employees, interacting with all kinds of different people on a daily basis, and they have limited interaction often with their manager. So we do see a trend where structured 360 feedback is starting to come back into the performance review processes that we're engaged with clients, simply because it brings those voices into the project, into the product, into the process, in a virtual world that we're all living in. And we separate this from continuous feedback a little bit, because we can bring continuous feedback in here too, through check-ins and performance notes, and asking managers and employees to document a performance journal, so that when they get feedback and when they provide feedback, it's actually really evidence-based. And if we can do this on a more frequent basis, it actually will take time away later in the year, because we're having these conversations all year long, and people know what to expect when they go into their final conversation of the year, if that's what you're doing. Two other elements in the content area that are important to talk about. We think it's really important to make sure your rating scales make sense to the content. And I said this before, we see a lot of this 5-point rating scale, probably 9 times out of 10 when someone sends us a performance review, this is the rating scale that's used. We think the world has changed quite a bit in rating scales, and how we look at it is different than what many do. We really think that the world's moved away from numbers. Certainly Morgan Stanley, a good quote here about how they have moved their ratings to 5 adjectives that help describe performance for employees. The rating scale advice we have is to use them. We do know there's a trend out there there have been a trend to get away from ratings. Oftentimes when we saw the rating systems without ratings, organizations were still doing them. You think about Deloitte, they say they don't have ratings, but they're asking the manager 4 questions about, the employee and how often they'd want them at the team. So if you're not using ratings, oftentimes what creeps in here is this concept of ghost ratings. And, the ghost ratings are things that, just happen to make sure rewards happen. We do have some rating scale recommendations. For goals, we look at frequency, progress, and say, how often has that goal been achieved? And so you guys, you can download this content that we have here, this presentation, to get these examples. For competencies, we often use a frequency scale that talks about observation in the competency area and how often we observe it. Okay, so give some thought to this, but the clear message is make sure rating scales match the content. And then lastly, I would just say on AI, the world is changing. And the key takeaway from the AI discussion is going to be this. As HR, we can't regulate it. Everybody's going to use it. So the answer is to educate everyone on its proper use, especially as it relates to performance reviews. And we know that it fits with reviews. We just need to make sure that we have a proper organizational policy that deals with AI. We as Quisitive help a lot of organizations with this. But where it's okay to share it, where it's okay to use it, what the ethics are of it are really important. And so when we get to the end of this content area, we say, okay, this is the key takeaway. Where do these content areas fit within the performance review process? And so you can see here, classic with the first 4. We add the next 4 to modern, and radical are really about goals, career planning, and continuous feedback. So to sum up, now that we know the content, we can create templates, and that just becomes, what our desired outcome is, what the frequency is, pick the content areas, make them suitable to the audience. We have the top 5 templates, and we're going to do, encourage you all to come out and join us on July 22nd. We're going to do a webinar just on this, but new hire onboarding review template, the gold standard ongoing review with 360, the skill-based review template, the check-in template, and the project review template are the main templates that we always try to drive clients to. And you can see how the content fits within these, because we've got the objectives and company values piece with the new hire onboarding. It sets the tone for objective setting in the organization, and that it's going to be part of your career with our organization, because in the first 90 days you're with us, we're talking about objectives and company values. The gold standard with ongoing review and 360, usually this is very popular with our clients: objectives, competencies, development, layered in with quarterly feedback, quarterly check-ins, some peer review in some cases, and the ability to do continuous feedback if the client wants to. The skill-based review template is often useful for certain segments of the employee population. And in that skill-based review template, it may not apply to everyone, but it applies to certain categories of employees. We also develop sometimes pure check-in templates. So this would be the kind of thing that Adobe would do. On an ad hoc basis, I'm going to have a check-in with an employee, and we're going to talk about objectives, career planning, and continuous feedback. And lastly, it's the project review template, where at the end of a significant project, whether it's an internal project, an external project, you can define the word project to mean something different. If you want a milestone, or maybe it's a certain certain process the organization's been through, that we go in and look at competency reviews and peer feedback to say, hey, how does this fit within how does this fit within the projects that we do and what we're trying to achieve? So these 5 templates work in 90% of the companies we have and that we work with. And I think one of the important things we say about these templates is you don't have to have just one, right? You can have different templates for different employee segments. And I think that's really important to understand in a modern performance review process. It doesn't need to be one size fits all. You can have different templates. You could actually have more than one model. You may have a classic model for a certain employee segment, a modern model for a certain employee segment, and even a radical model for a certain employee segment. We do have clients with all 3. So, main takeaways today: best practices, plan for change. I'm big on this one. Don't boil the ocean. I always say it. This can evolve over time. We should allow performance management to evolve over time, because our managers and employees are going to evolve. And as they evolve, the performance management process can evolve. We could think about a performance management roadmap that's 3 to 5 years out, and what we're trying to achieve in each of the next 3 to 5 years. We think it's critical to incorporate more frequent feedback to increase engagement. No question about that. Want to make the reviews more forward-looking, the career planning, setting objectives, what we did last quarter, what we're trying to achieve next quarter, important. Including more voices in the process. We can't get away from this virtual world we're in. So if you can find a way to bring peers into the process to provide feedback, that's going to be very helpful. And lastly, encourage you to think carefully about content and ratings. And you can refer back to the presentation that we've attached here to get more of the information on there. I did have to, kind of move a little quick there just at the end to make sure we got through this in time. But with all of that, I'd like to thank you all for joining today. Encourage you to come out and talk more, see in live action these top 5 review templates that we talk about. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us. And at this point, I'll say thanks and pass it back to our HR.com moderator.
I'd like to thank John, as well as all of you, for joining us today. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archived recording will be available on the HR.com website within 24 hours. The webcast credit will show in your HR.com account within 2 business days, and we'll also send you an email with your credit information. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened in a new browser page on your computer. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.